Now, what I would ask you to do is join with me in welcoming DeAnne Julius in the traditional way to this podium. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart. I'm delighted to be here today and have this chance to participate in the City UK's Autumn Debate. I feel as though I'm very much on home turf. Despite being an American by birth, I am a Londoner by choice and have been for the last 25 years. So I certainly am happy to help in any way I can in promoting the role of London and the City of London in particular. For an international economist, working in the City of London is really working at the coalface, because this is where ideas and practice come together when it comes to international finance and international business. But I must say it's not an easy task this morning in particular to give you an overview of the economic scene. In fact, I was cursing Stuart yesterday as I was thinking I really must get my ideas together for this, having procrastinated with the good excuse that events were changing so rapidly that it was very difficult to know where they would be by this morning. We are really living in a fast-forward speed, especially in Europe. And what I thought I could probably do is at least give you two versions of how I think things develop. Exactly a best case and a worst case in the sense of true extremes. Things could be even worse than I think will happen, and perhaps even better. But at least to help couch the debate and give some context for where we may be going in the Eurozone crisis. I had hoped I might be able to stand up this morning and call a turning point in that crisis. I had hoped, with the agreement that was reached between Merkel and Sarkozy about a week ago, that agreement would stick with the % haircut on Greek debt for commercial banks, that the G20 would meet and it would endorse that agreement, and it would perhaps add to the pot with a bit of IMF money. But of course, that was not to be. Instead, we saw the call for the referendum, and then the withdrawal of the call for the referendum. We saw the European leaders make it explicit for the first time that there is a real prospect that Greece would be ejected from the Eurozone. We saw the Americans, the Chinese, in fact the IMF, refusing to commit to a specific sum of money for the Europeans until they sort out their problems themselves. We saw the Asian monetary and financial officials in a state of astonishment, really, that their counterparts in the Eurozone had let things slip this far, had lost control of what was happening in the Eurobond markets. So that's where things stood last night. This morning I awoke to find that indeed there was at least a small chink of good news with the Greek government deciding that they would form a government of national unity and set up a new cabinet. Well, it's still not a pretty picture, and I can't predict where it will end, but I think I can talk about where it might go and perhaps frame some of the debate at least. What I'd like to do just before that, though, is to make two general observations. I don't think we should be entirely, and I'm sure we won't be entirely concerned with just European issues today. So two rather general observations about the global economic backdrop that I think it's important to keep in mind. One is just to remember that the world economy these days has a split personality. The Western countries are slow growing, perhaps stagnant, near stagnant, while the Eastern economies, the emerging markets, are rapidly growing, in some cases booming. Now that's been true for quite a while, but I think, at least in my opinion, it's likely to continue to be true for the next couple of years. Now, by that, I'm not one who believes in complete decoupling of the emerging markets from the rich world, but I think that we are at a point where China in particular, and India for even longer, have developed a self-sustaining growth model, which is much more based on domestic demand in their economies than simply on export demand to our economies. They're not all the way there yet, but I think the evidence is certainly there in China's aggregate growth figures that more of the growth is being driven domestically and indeed with intra-Asian connections. The other reason that I think that the emerging markets will continue to grow rapidly for the next couple of years, even in spite of the problems that we're having on this side of the world, is that their macroeconomic fundamentals are actually quite strong, quite supportive of growth. Their budget deficits are low, their debt to GDP ratios are fine, are well under control. They have moderate inflation, and when inflation looks as though it's moving up in China in particular, the Chinese government has an array of tools in its toolkit, which probably makes our Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee completely jealous, because they are actually able to control credit in their economy. And of course, they also control the banks. That may mean that the banks are not nearly as sophisticated as our banks, but on the other hand, they also don't have some of the problems of bad debt that we're faced with. And if they do, the government is there to bail them out. So for various reasons, I think that we can expect to see rapid growth in the emerging market economies, and that's a very positive thing for us. As Stuart points out, here in London in particular, we are connected globally, so growth there is an important plus. Closer to home, though, I think the other side of this split personality is that we are probably in for a couple more years of slow growth in the Western world, almost regardless of what happens in the Eurozone. And that's because we are still in this deleveraging process, having come off the big credit bubble and burst of that bubble 3 or 4 years ago. Many of you will know the now famous work by Reinhardt and Rogoff looking at the economic history of recessions that have been caused by banking and financial crises. And one of the conclusions of that study, which is a very long-term cross-country study, was that it generally takes as long to deleverage, to get out of that situation, as it took for the credit bubble to build up. Now, that would imply for us that we're probably about halfway through the process now, and we've probably got another couple of years of deleveraging, which means slow growth to go. That situation for Britain probably suggests that we'll be in the 1% to 1.5% GDP growth range for the next year or two. We'll see soon what the Office of Budget Responsibility has to say, but it does seem to me that we simply have to accept that we are in this process. We need to get ourselves out of it. There's no quick and easy or better alternative, in my view, than the path that we're on. It will be difficult for business, but not a disaster, to be slow growing, and for households as well as governments to repair their balance sheets. My second general observation is that financial markets have lost their natural bearings. And this provides some real risks for policymakers, not quite knowing what to do in these circumstances, and of course for investors. What do I mean by the natural bearings of financial markets? Well, interest rates have been near zero for quite a long time now, a couple of years, and it looks as though they'll remain that way for the near future, negative in real terms. The bond purchases, the massive bond purchases by central banks in this country, in the US, in Japan, in the Eurozone, have created rather a false market in sovereign debt, where interest rates don't reflect the actual credit risk and differential credit risk that is out there. The US government debt lost its AAA rating, and that destroyed a key pillar in our understanding of what a risk-free rate actually means. Commercial banks are finding it expensive to raise funds, and indeed sometimes in the past 18 months the market has pretty much closed for new bank unsecured bond issues. And then banks are also under the contradictory pressures, with their politicians telling them they need to lend more, especially to small businesses, and the regulators saying they need to build up their capital and liquidity. So all of these are unnatural conditions and unusual circumstances, unusual for banks, unusual for investors, and I think that that is almost certain to result in continued market volatility as the risk appetite shifts back and forth with every new headline. And that really brings me back to the headlines, especially in Europe. What might those headlines look like over the next 6 months? Well, as I said, I think maybe it's useful to talk about a worst case and a best case, a worst feasible case and a best feasible case. And just so that I can end on a positive note, I'd like to look at the worst case first, and then I'll get to the better case. I think the worst case, in my mind, has kind of three key elements. One is a disorderly default by Greece. That could mean there'll be a delay in forming the coalition government. The IMF will not be able to release the next tranche of its support because the Greek parliament won't pass, or won't pass with a big majority, the kind of reform package that they need to. The civil servants won't get paid, possibly not at the end of November, certainly not by the end of December. The expiring government debt won't be able to be rolled over, and a partial or a whole default of some sort will be declared by the Greek government. That would happen probably in early December under this worst case scenario. At the same time, I think the worst case would be if Greece says it still wants to remain in the euro despite this, which will cause all sorts of difficulties within the eurozone. There would then be domestic bank runs in Greece, general chaos. So a very difficult situation in Greece. Immediate contagion, this is the second element of this worst case scenario, immediate contagion to the banks that hold Greek debt. We know who those banks are, but it's not a huge amount, I have to say, and it's also mostly been impaired now. So it's a known unknown, as it were. But it wouldn't only be the banks that hold Greek debt, it would also trigger the credit default swaps if Greece unilaterally declared a default, if it wasn't a voluntary issue. Things get a little more murky there in terms of who is on the other side of these insurance vehicles. I saw some good analysis by Citi recently that talked about $75 billion of gross exposure to Greek CDSs, but only $4 billion net exposure. It strikes me as odd, but that's what the data show. So I think we don't really know what the implications would be of the CDS, at least I don't know what the implications would be of triggering the CDSs, but probably the largest banks in the US and perhaps some here would be the ones who are on the other side, since those are the main market makers in this. The ECB, of course, is the outfit that holds the bulk of the Greek debt, probably something like 50 billion euros at face value. Now, that sounds like a lot compared to the subscribed capital of the ECB, which is only 10 billion. But on the other hand, this is debt in its own currency, as it were, and the central bank can always essentially print its way out of trouble in the short run. So my conclusion is that in terms of the immediate contagion to banks, I think there would be losses, they would be painful, but they're mostly, by this time, well anticipated, and I think manageable. So the difficulty really is the third step in this scenario, which would be this escalating contagion to other governments in the Eurozone. Italy, of course, is the big problem there. In this scenario, Berlusconi would try to cling to power. He's been pretty good at doing that for quite a while. His coalition would not be able to pass the necessary reforms because it doesn't have much of a majority. The interest rates on Italian debt would continue to rise. They're already above 6%, which in the medium term is unsustainable when debt is 120% of GDP, and GDP is not growing at anything like 6%. This puts the ECB in a very difficult position because it is already pretty much the only buyer in town for Italian government debt. And without a reform program in place, the ECB would find it very hard to justify continued purchase of the amount of debt we'd be talking about. So I think in this downside scenario, it is a recipe for the eventual breakup of the Eurozone with all that entails for financial markets, for the European economy, and indeed the European political cohesion. Now, simply because that is such a dire scenario, I don't think it will happen. I think that there will be sufficient energy remaining behind the European leaders to avoid that if they possibly can. So let me finish by talking about the best case scenario, which again I think has a number of key elements. The first one being a change in political leadership, both in Greece and in Italy. I think we're seeing that in Greece as of last night. We'll see what happens in Italy. A democratic regime change. And in the case of Italy, if they move to what they call a technocratic government, there are certainly some very able technocrats in the elite in Italy. So that would be a very positive step. Under that new kind of leadership, in Greece, they would be offered pretty much the same package that was negotiated a week and a half ago, including this voluntary debt reduction. So CDS swaps would not be triggered. It would be made clear, though, that any slippage in that reform package would mean ejection from the euro, so that the pressure would stay up on Greece. The new Italian leadership would, I think, be able to commit to a reform package. The elements of that are known. They would need to commit to that with IMF monitoring, which they've agreed to in any case in terms of the monitoring. And that package of change, political change and political commitment in Greece and, importantly, in Italy, would be sufficient in this scenario for the ECB to continue buying in the secondary market Italian debt, and if necessary, to step up its purchases of Spanish debt. That, in my view, is the only way that a firewall can really be built around the solvent countries in the Eurozone, and that is critical in this best-case scenario. Now, of course, that doesn't solve all the problems of the Eurozone. It doesn't address competitiveness issues, but many of those issues will be addressed later in this conference, and they will certainly take longer than the 6-month time frame of the expiry of these scenarios, or longer than I have to speak to you. So let me end there. As Stuart knows, I am not usually an economist that talks about on the one hand, on the other hand. Usually I can make up my mind. But this situation has defeated me. I think that the Eurozone is really at a hinge of history, as sometimes people talk about. And I am neither wise enough nor perhaps foolish enough to predict which way it will go. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take them. Yeah.
But DeAnne is wise enough to invite a couple of questions if there are people that can see one hand here already.
Yes. That's better. I'll declare my affiliation because it's only fair. Richard Metcalf, International Swaps and Derivatives Association. And it's an opportunity to make a comment, but also to raise what I think is a serious question, which is about a tendency to shoot the messenger. And it links to your comments about credit default swaps. I can assure you that for anybody who wants to go and look, the information is there about the net exposure, together with an explanation of why that actually makes sense and why it follows the same patterns we saw in relation to credit default swaps, for example, on Lehman Brothers, where there was about 70 billion gross outstanding, but the amounts that actually settled were under 5 billion. So we have past experience as well as data which is publicly available through the DTCC Trade Information Warehouse, which proves precisely that point. So you end up with a situation where the amounts settling, if there was a sovereign default, in the case of Greece, would be in the order of 1 to 2% of the debt outstanding. It seems to me that the question here is there a tendency to shoot the messenger? We've seen this in relation to short-selling measures in some countries. We've seen this, we must avoid anything happening in the credit default swaps market because that's not just a signal of investor appetite, which of course is also reflected in bond spreads, but somehow driving the market. Do you think there's some risk of getting confused and getting cause and effect mixed up here?
Well, let me thank you, first of all, for informing us on some of that. I think that is the benefit of this being a debate. Hopefully we'll all learn some things from it. And I'm reassured that you agree the net exposure is, in fact, even less than I think the figures I quoted in the case of Greece. I think there certainly is a risk of searching for someone to blame, and CDSs might well come in for some of that. I'm personally not sure that naked CDSs are a good idea, but there are many people more expert in this audience than I am. So I think, hope to learn from the rest of you. But I think certainly there is a continuing tendency on the part of the politicians and indeed on the part of the voters to look for anybody they can find to blame for some of the crisis. And the crisis was big enough that there are plenty of people one can blame for it. That is a risk.
Thank you. There's one in the second row here. Microphone just coming to you. Sorry, microphone just there.
Brennan Davies, Gatehouse Bank. You You haven't said very much about the US economy, which does seem to show some signs of, certainly at the bank level, the money growth, broad money supply seems to be growing reasonably well, which is a sign the banking system may be recovering significantly and helping to flow capital through to private industry and individuals. I would like to hear a little bit, if you can, on your views about the US economy, because we may all think it's less than it was, but it's still pretty massive.
I think I'd lump the U.S. economy in with the general comment that we'll see slow growth generally across the OECD countries. The U.S. economy does still have a massive debt to confront. Public sector debt, and it's also got private sector debt that is not yet completely worked off. I think in the private sector, the housing market is still a real concern. There is still an overhang on the supply side of housing. There is still a very large component of the housing debt that means those households are in negative equity territory, and they have a bigger incentive to just walk away from that than households in this country because of the legal structure of them being able to do that. So I think there are still some pretty fundamental issues that have to be resolved either with policy action, which I don't expect in the US, at least until after the election, or with a very gradual process of deleveraging. On the government side, because the dollar is the world's anchor currency, because the Chinese pretty much have to buy dollars with some of their reserves anyway, because the dollar is in a much different situation than any other world currency, I don't expect there to be a triggering event, as it were, that will cause any sort of major disaster in the U.S. financial markets. But on the other hand, I see too many obstacles in the way to expect anything more than very anemic growth, with unemployment remaining pretty high for the next couple of years. And I think the consumer surveys, the confidence measures in the U.S. are corroborating that view, unfortunately.
Just take one last question. I know, otherwise I think we could probably occupy DeAnne all day.
Thank you very much. Tony Gillen from the Institute of Ideas. I just wanted to draw you to your point about European leaders, and you said that you hope they have the energy to prevent your worst case scenario. My question is it really about their energy levels, or is it about their political leadership? Because if things are going to move forward in a more constructive way, presumably we need some sort of political union to underpin the Eurozone. And that needs to be an argument that's won by politicians with the public, and we can see that that's not happening at the moment. And if that's not going to be the case, then we seem to have very narrow interpretation of national self-interest at the moment, which in a global market, when push comes to shove in these difficult circumstances, narrow national self-interest isn't necessarily the best way forward. So what would be your recipe for stronger political leadership?
That is a tough one. Well, first of all, some self-justification. My scenarios are only 6 months long, and I'm pretty sure we're not going to see political union in the next 6 months, for better or worse. I think that within Europe, we just have to accept that it is always going to be a matter of negotiation, and negotiation at so many levels that it's complicated. You know, negotiation among the political leaders in the Eurozone, negotiation among the wider G20, Europe within the G20, negotiation between political parties every time there's an election in Germany or in Italy, and negotiation within the countries. You know, the United States has a political union, but that has not really helped very much in terms of making progress on the budget deficit. So that's not the end-all and be-all either. I think this is a messy process, and it's complicated in the case of our world, of the financial world, because it's also intrinsically a complicated thing to explain to people. And so it is very difficult to, I mean, I haven't personally tried to explain to any of the campers around St. Paul's, but I think I'd have a very difficult time explaining, at least in my understanding, of what's going on. So because you've got a very complicated problem at root, you're not in a good position to start with because austerity doesn't appeal to anybody. And the political structures, not only in Europe but elsewhere, are not handling this situation particularly well either. And I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think those are just intrinsic problems when economics and finance hit politics.
DeAnne, that's an absolutely perfect segue into our introducing Kay Swinburne to speak to us now from the political standpoint.
Excellent.
DeAnne, thank you very much indeed.
You.